wisdom in the Psalms. That's what we're looking at in this series. And it starts, we found, with knowing that God has spoken. The height of foolishness is pretending he isn't there to hold us accountable. So the opposite is knowing that he is and therefore doing what he says. So today we're going to get some practical examples of that. Just a few things that we're going to be looking at in Psalm 15 to see how we can actually live, mostly how we can speak with wisdom. Insights into the ways that we can do that, and understanding that the Lord has expectations for the members of his household. If that's what we are, then we need to learn and follow the house rules in order to maintain a happy home. So as I said, we're going to be in Psalm 15. If you bring your Bible from week to week and you put your handout right in there, then you would have opened up right to it because this is the very next psalm. But otherwise, if you don't have a Bible, we've got them on the counter, or maybe you're looking on your phone. Psalm 15, and we're going to begin with just the first verse. It says, "Lord, who may abide in your tabernacle? Who may dwell in your holy hill?" Now also, like last week, Psalm 14, this one is another one of the Psalms of David. It's not clear necessarily that he wrote this one right after Psalm 14, but they do certainly have a way that they tie together. It kind of feels like this is following off of the way that Psalm 14 ended, particularly in its final verse, because in verse 7 there it had said, "Oh, that the salvation of Israel would come out of Zion. When the Lord brings back the captivity of his people, let Jacob rejoice and Israel be glad." So what we had seen throughout that psalm was that David understood foolishness results in alienation from God. And he kind of predicted, not necessarily in a supernatural sense, like a prophetic sense, just more in a common sense, that national foolishness would result in national alienation. Eventually expulsion, that they would lose the promised land. But what he did know by God's direct guidance was that he was merciful and that he would restore his repentant people and bring them back. Well, people who are in that position, who understand God's mercy, they should be grateful for it. And that's the background for this psalm and for the questions of this first verse. Those who have found their way to the Lord's house, they have to ask themselves, what does it take to stay? And just to really drive this home, we're not talking about staying in the worship center per se, the tabernacle or the temple that was eventually built by David's son Solomon. This is deeper than that. It's really about relationship, not just location. It's about dwelling. Being at home in the household of God. There's a right way to be part of the family. And some of that is what this psalm is going to walk us through. As we go back now and to verse 2, where he begins to answer this question by saying, "He who walks uprightly and works righteousness and speaks the truth in his heart. He who does not backbite with his tongue, nor does evil to his neighbor, nor does he take up a reproach against his friend, in whose eyes a vile person is despised, but he honors those who fear the Lord." So David is kind of getting specific here, but he doesn't start out that way. Verse 2 is still pretty general, which is a good reminder that even the more specific examples that we find here, they aren't comprehensive. This isn't supposed to be all the rules for ethical behavior. It's just a short list, not the whole list. These examples, though, fit into the opening that is all-inclusive. First of all, with the way that we walk. Your direction in life is supposed to be upright, which means a couple things. And for one thing, we're not supposed to be stooping or skulking through life, but it's also about the path that we are taking, that it's not supposed to be crooked. It's not supposed to be going in and out of the shadows to hide ourselves. We are supposed to be head held high, eyes straight forward, going on to the goal that we know we are pursuing. Walking in light, which is the way that the Apostle Paul puts it in Ephesians. In chapter 5 there, verses 1, 2, and 8, he says, "Therefore be imitators of God as dear children, and walk in love, as Christ also has loved us and given himself for us, an offering and a sacrifice to God for a sweet-smelling aroma. For you were once darkness, but now you are light in the Lord. Walk as children of light." And so what this means is we're supposed to be following in Christ's footsteps as we live, on the Spirit's road, moving toward the Father. And that means, as we are on the way, that there are things that we are supposed to do. That's the next element of what David said there in verse 2, is that we are supposed to be working righteousness. Now, this, though, also requires some wisdom, because it's not that we are supposed to have a works righteousness. And that is an important distinction, because works righteousness is pretty much what everybody does. That's what we are naturally inclined to do. That's what every other religion in the world is centered around. That is what Christianity too often falls into. And it's the idea that you can work hard enough to make God owe you happiness. And that's what we think that we can do, but as David pointed out in what we looked at last week, no one can. No one is able to actually live that perfectly. Instead, we are supposed to understand that our righteousness is by grace. That is God's gift to us, what He has provided that we cannot provide ourselves and do not deserve, but He is good enough to do that. It's what He did through Christ. But because we have that, that is what we work out of. We are supposed to, as a result of the grace we've received, have an impact on the world around us for good. And it's supposed to be an active one as well. It's not supposed to be just avoiding harming anyone. It is supposed to be actually helping them, being vulnerable enough to do what is right for someone, even if it comes at a cost. And again, the reason we're supposed to do that is because it's what Jesus did. If we're His followers, we should look like Him in the world. Now, the last element of David's general instruction, again, verse 2 here, is that we have to say what needs to be said. And that's where the next verse ends up going, but this comes first. It's not just what we say to others, it's what you tell yourself. Being honest with yourself, having integrity of belief, sincerity. If religion is just for show, it's hypocrisy. It's a disguise. And while it might fool some people, it never deceives God. Devotion has to come from the heart. That is where we need to embrace the truth, and then from there we do and say the rest. That's what then verse 3 goes into. He describes there the types of external speech that come from an insincere heart and are therefore for us to avoid. First of all, he mentions backbiting. Now, that's not a phrase that we hear too much. Backsass might be more familiar for those who know their SpongeBob, or just talking back. You know, we all are familiar with that, I think, and so that's what's being mentioned here. And it doesn't make it immoral to answer a criticism. That's not what this means. It's the biting that's the bad part. It's comments that are designed to harm when we don't actually have an answer for a criticism. In the rules of logic, it's what's known as an ad hominem attack, that we're going after the person instead of what it was that they had to say. It's an insult when we can't handle the argument. And even if they insult us first, that's not the appropriate way for us to respond. It is ungodly to do that in kind. So if we're going to answer, it needs to be with an actual answer, not just going after them for daring to criticize us. Now next, he talks about not doing evil to your neighbor. And that feels kind of broad again, maybe. And it is, you know, in general, we want to avoid any form of evil that we might do to other people. But David's bringing this up in the context of speech. That's what he's talking about, is saying anything evil to somebody else. And that's because, or even about somebody else, and that's because speech is kind of the center of the process. It's the bridge. Because sin starts in the heart, and usually with envy. We see that somebody has something that we want, we think we deserve it, they don't, and it upsets us. Then from there, that envy is often expressed as wishing that person harm, cursing them. Now, in the ancient world, they're very common for a curse to actually be intended as a literal curse, that they were hoping to involve evil spirits somehow in order to call down some type of judgment on the person that they wanted to hurt. We don't tend to mean that so much anymore. Instead, it's just what's called an imprecation. We're just saying something bad about them. But either way, it's about hoping to see them suffer And it's often not very long of a road going from wishes and words to action. And that's a problem. What begins in the heart comes out of the mouth and eventually spreads to the hands. That's something that we find Jesus speaking of in Matthew chapter 15, verses 18 and 19. He says, "Those things which proceed out of the mouth come from the heart, and they defile a man. For out of the heart proceeds evil thoughts, murders, adulteries, fornications, thefts, false witness, and blasphemies." So David is really talking about this same concept too, is that we should watch what we say because of where that can go. We should not speak evil of others in order to not do evil to others. And in order to avoid that speech, we need to not be feeling evil toward others. And also, this spoken evil, we have to recognize, and it's the last element of what he's talking about there in verse 3, is that evil is worse the closer the relationship is. We know our friends best, which means that we can use that against them and cut them the deepest. But what we should do is defend them, not pick up and share the gossip against them, certainly not to be the ones who actually start it. And when we are driven by anger or envy, we might say something that we can never take back. And that's especially destructive if it's about another member of God's family. It can make for a very awkward home life. So David again is saying this is what we need to avoid. But then after all of this, verse 4, the start of it there, comes in as kind of a system shock, because how does it make sense, in light of what he's just said, that we are supposed to despise anyone? It doesn't seem very nice, and it almost feels contradictory after everything in verse 3. But again, we have to have wisdom to understand this, to see that this is included too in the concept of speaking the truth. And part of the truth is that niceness and goodness aren't the same thing. They're not synonyms. And also the truth is that some people are evil, and they do evil. And wisdom is in acknowledging that. Now, we don't need to stoop to their level when criticizing them. We don't have to backbite. But we are supposed to avoid association with them and with their evil behavior as much as possible. And also to offer correction when necessary. We aren't supposed to coddle their errors and make them feel like they're perfectly fine the way they are. The truth is, they're not. And if we pretend that way, it's not going to help them escape the consequences. They need to know the costs. And sometimes we have to say, I think I need to stay away. Or maybe you had better stay away. So that their loss of welcome with us becomes the warning of their potentially not receiving the welcome of the Lord. And to hopefully teach them. And again, we have to be honest with that too, to be able to say, we want to be with you, but what you're doing now makes that impossible. So that they can learn that lesson. But then also, David does present the flip side. At the same time we recognize evil, we also should offer recognition to wisdom and righteousness. The fear of the Lord, that's what he means by that. We should praise it when we see it. People should be told when we notice them working hard and doing well, so that it's an encouragement to them to keep it up. If that is honest, and if it's Christ-centered, if it's not just about puffing them up so that we can then try to get something out of them, some type of favor, then it's appropriate. It's really necessary. That is the way that we should speak to one another, not only offering criticisms, but also offering that type of praise for what is done well, what is done in wisdom. So from there, we're going to go back to verse 4 because David gets even a little bit more specific. Chapter 15, verse 4, he says, again, answering that initial question, "He who swears to his own hurt and does not change, he who does not put out his money at usury, nor does he take a bribe against the innocent." So you may be wondering, possibly, especially if you're looking at your own Bibles or just thinking about the fact that I interrupted verse 4, is why would I do that? Why would I just break the flow of what it was that David was saying? He's still talking about the way that we speak. How is this a change in subject? Well, it's because, again, he's narrowed it down. It's not just about speech in general anymore, which was already more specific than where he started, but it's speech about money. That's what he's talking about in these few phrases. And so this is a lesson for us basically in economics and how we're supposed to approach that ethically. So the first element of this, having to do with money, is that we should keep the promises that we make, even if it costs us. And so this is saying, if you promise to make somebody a loan in order to help them, you should give them that money. Or on the other hand, if you have promised to pay back a loan, if you put your signature on the dotted line, pay it back. That's what you're accountable to do. Now, just take note, it's not necessary to take this the other way around. This is not saying that you should make promises that you know will hurt you, as though you're obligated to that. It's not going that far. It just means don't go back on your word because you found a better offer or because you don't feel like it. And of course, this should be applied to all of our other promises too. It's not just about money, but that's the particular realm that he's in, and it's obviously one that affects a lot of us. Now, flowing from that, what he says next is, if you're going to keep your promises, well, you should also not let people make harmful promises to you. Because that's what usury is. It's a form of charging interest, but it's more than that. It's actually being predatory in the interest that you charge. Now, of course, what I would think that stands above everything else for that would be credit card rates right now. I know interest rates are up in general, but a lot of credit cards, they're over 30% in interest. And that is evil as far as I'm concerned. That's sinful that those companies are charging that. But it's for more than just them. It is for anyone unjust to demand what we know people cannot pay because they are not in a position to reject our terms. And so we can't just say, well, it's wrong of those companies to do that. We need to think about how we're maybe doing that to each other. And again, maybe not always with just money, but it does apply to money most clearly. But in any situation where there's an urge to take advantage of people, that's something that we should not do. But now the last of these probably is the hardest to apply broadly, because there's not many people who are even in a position to take a bribe. So now, obviously, those who are should refuse. And so if you're talking about people in kind of a governmental position, I guess if it's going to talk to anybody here, most specifically it would be me as a tax collector. So it's telling me not to do that. But again, we can try to see how this potentially works as more than just money changing hands. So if we're going to look at a bribe that way, it's that we should not be looking for personal gain in a situation rather than for what is right, because that's a subversion of justice. And it inevitably hurts someone who doesn't deserve it. Now, it might feel kind of clever to take advantage that way, but even if it's clever, it isn't wise. If it's not wise, it's foolish, and foolishness results in consequences. So again, that's why it's to be avoided. Now, looking at all of these examples that are in the meat, the body of Psalm 15, it should help us to realize something, which is that it doesn't take very much to go wrong, does it? We aren't discussing heinous crimes here. We mentioned a few just because they were in the list that Jesus presented. But for the psalm itself, this is mostly just about careless words and bad business. We can all be guilty of that, which is the point. We have a lot to be aware of if we want to really experience all the promises of goodness. And so that's just the phrase that David wraps up with in order to close the book on this psalm, I guess we could say, and answer the question that was at the start of it. He just says, "He who does these things shall never be moved." It is the person who behaves this way that gets to stay in the home of God. Now, this also reflects the image of the wise, of the blessed, that we saw a couple weeks ago in Psalm 1, in verse 3, where it had said, "He shall be like a tree planted by the rivers of water, that brings forth its fruit in its season, whose leaf also shall not wither, and whatever he does shall prosper." The idea, very simply, is that morality offers stability. Behaving properly builds healthy relationships with God and others. Knowing we have a home, Knowing we have a firm foundation gives us security, even when we are facing threats. But on the other hand, if you tear out your own roots, if you are a terror at home, then you'll be shaken, swept away, thrown out. And that is, again, on the basis of what we looked at last week. That's what we're all in danger of. And so that's why, as always, I have to make the whole truth clear. This psalm shows us ways that we can all go wrong. We need to go further and acknowledge that we have all gone wrong. Wisdom is doing your best, but it's also recognizing your failures. And like everything else then, that points us to the gospel. We have a debt to God that we cannot repay, but Jesus more than made up for the shortfall by offering his life in our place on the cross. And his resurrection opens the door to give us the home from which we cannot be removed, because our welcome in God's presence depends on Christ, not on us. So ultimately, we do not behave as David recommends in order to make ourselves belong. Again, it's not a works righteousness. We want to behave these ways because we're overjoyed to have been given belonging. And so these are ways for us to make the most of that life now that we are going to live forever. But of course, not everyone is there yet. If you haven't made your way home, if you're not a Christian, whether that's somebody here or somebody who just, you find this later on the internet, now is the time to see that you are not in good standing with the Lord. Your words and your actions make you vile to him. Now, that is not my judgment of you. That's God's judgment. He has a very high standard. But I want you also to know I'm not saying that because I think I'm better than you. I know that I'm not. That's kind of the point, is that there is as much forgiveness and welcome available to you as there is to me and to anyone else, if you'll take it by trusting in the one who offers it, which again is not me. It's Jesus Christ, who died and rose again so that you can come home. I hope that you can do that today. For those who have, the Christians who are here, and again, watching later online, remember that you have done what wisdom most requires. You saw your errors, and that taught you the fear of God, but then you came to the cross, and that taught you his love. So live in the difference that he has made. Speak in truth and show a heart of devotion so that others can see God's heart for them and find their way home too.